Hi everyone. Today we're going to be talking about fiscal policy. We're also going to be talking about crowding out and a little bit about the loanable funds graph. Fiscal policy is the government influencing the economy with government spending and taxes. Okay, so the two tools of fiscal policy is government spending and taxes. We can use both of these two tools or we can use one. Okay, so using these two tools, the government can either expand or shrink our economy. With this in mind, we will begin to talk about the two basic types of fiscal policy, non-discretionary and discretionary fiscal policy. Okay, so non-discretionary fiscal policy. Non-discretionary fiscal policy is the other basic type of fiscal policy used by the government to influence the economy. However, this fiscal policy is not active like discretionary fiscal policy. It is automatic and includes automatic stabilizers, which automatically expand or shrink an economy. Now, the automatic stabilizers of non-discretionary fiscal policy are progressive taxes and transfer payments. Okay, so these are the automatic stabilizers of non-discretionary fiscal policy. Number one, transfer payments. Transfer payments are when the government redistributes income. A couple of examples of transfer payments would be welfare and Social Security. Number two, progressive taxes. Progressive taxes are the type of taxes in place in the United States now. So the more money you make, the more taxes you pay. Okay, so discretionary fiscal policy. Discretionary fiscal policy involves laws that are designed to change aggregate demand through government spending or taxation. The government, specifically Congress, are actively deciding to influence the economy when they meet and create these laws. Okay, so now we're going to move to expansionary and contractionary fiscal policy. First, we'll look at expansionary fiscal policy. Expansionary fiscal policy is one type of fiscal policy. It involves laws that reduce unemployment and increase GDP, gross domestic product. It is referred to as the gas because it can take an economy from recession to full employment. So it's called the gas because it can gas or fuel a country's economy up to full employment. This is why expansionary fiscal policy is used. It is used to bring an economy from recession or to close a recessionary gap. Now to the arrows. When the government wants to do expansionary fiscal policy, they will increase government spending or decrease taxes. Or they can do both. So let's say the government of a country uses both tools. When the government increases government spending, it will immediately go to aggregate demand. And when the government decreases taxes, it will then lead to an increase in consumer spending and then go to an increase in aggregate demand. So when there is an overall increase in aggregate demand, will lead to an increase in price level, which is represented right here. After an increase in price level, it will then lead to an increase in GDP, gross domestic product, which is represented right here. After an increase in GDP, it will lead to a decrease in unemployment, which is represented right here. With all this in mind, too much of this policy can lead an economy into inflation, which is where contractionary fiscal policy comes in. Okay, so moving on to contractionary fiscal policy. Contractionary fiscal policy is another type of fiscal policy. It involves laws that reduce inflation and decrease GDP. It is referred to as the brakes because it can take an economy from inflation to full employment. So it's called the brakes because it can stop a country's economy, like brakes stopping a car, from going further into inflation and brings it back to full employment. This is why policy is used. It can bring an economy from inflation or to close an inflationary gap. Now to the arrows. When a government wants to do contractionary fiscal policy, they will decrease government spending and they will increase taxes. Now, again, you can use government spending and taxes, or you can use one of the two. So again, let's say that a country wants to use contractionary fiscal policy or implement contractionary fiscal policy. So they will decrease government taxes, and when they do so, it will go immediately to aggregate demand, which will decrease, which is represented right here by the down arrow. And when they increase taxes, this will lead to a decrease in consumer spending, which will then lead to a decrease in aggregate demand. And after this overall decrease in aggregate demand, it will decrease price level right here, represented by the arrow, and it will then lead to gross domestic product decreasing as well. After gross domestic product decreases, it will lead to an increase in unemployment. With this in mind, too much of this policy can lead an economy into recession, which is where expansionary fiscal policy comes in. Okay, so now we're going to be talking about the main problem with fiscal policy. The main problem with it is that it takes a lot of time, and by a lot, I mean
a lot.
That's why I reiterated this statement by putting very slow in parentheses. And the reason for this is because the government has to realize or recognize that their economy is either in recession or is in inflation. And then once they recognize that their economy isn't doing so hot, then they go and they try to make this policy. But it takes a very long time, especially for this part, because they have to go back and forth between the branches of government. And once all of that transpires and they finally get the laws passed to influence their economy, then, a lot of time has gone by, So, yeah. Okay, now we're going to talk about crowding out, or the crowding out effect. Crowding out is when the government wants to spend more, a budget deficit, to spark economic growth. However, they borrow money from the banks, which will raise the interest rates, real interest rates, which will then lower investment. Crowding out occurs during expansionary fiscal policy, when the government has a budget deficit, when they spend too much money. This will now lead us to the loanable funds graph, because crowding out can be shown on this graph. And then, okay, so this is the loanable funds graph. We will later be talking about how crowding out is shown on this graph and how crowding out relates to the loanable funds graph. Okay, so now I'm going to explain the symbols on the graph. So the first thing right here, RIR, is real interest rates. The S over here is supply, but for this graph, it really means savers. And for D, down here, it is demand, but for this graph, it means borrowers. And then Q, down here, is quantity, the quantity of money in banks. The loanable funds graph is the money funds in the banks. That's what it shows. And the dotted lines right here represents the equilibrium. So essentially, when we go down here and follow this dotted line, this is where the quantity of money is at equilibrium in the banks. And then over here is where the real interest rates are at equilibrium in the banks. Okay, so this is how the crowding out effect looks on the loanable funds graph. Now I will explain why the crowding out effect looks this way on the graph. Now keep in mind that when crowding out happens, it's during expansionary fiscal policy. Okay, so when the government runs expansionary fiscal policy, an increase in government spending and a decrease in taxes to grow their economy, this causes them to have a budget deficit because they're increasing government spending. In order to pay for this deficit, they borrow money from banks, which causes an increase in demand on the graph right here. In response to the lack of money the banks now have, the banks raise interest rates, which made it so that the consumers and the businesses have to spend less. which means a decrease in consumer spending and a decrease in I sub G, interest-sensitive spending. Thanks for watching, and I'm sorry about how long this video is. Hi everyone, today we're going to be talking about fiscal policy. Okay, so there are two tools, and the two tools are, okay. So, why? Can I do this right for once? Hi everyone. Okay, so, okay. Okay, Blair.